When Democratic presidential candidates visit Georgia, they usually stick to Metro Atlanta.
This week, the Harris-Walz campaign took their blue campaign bus farther afield.
So, Georgia, I love you back. I love you back. And we have 68 days to go until this election. 68 days to go.
Vice President Kamala Harris and Minnesota Governor Tim Walz rallied voters around coastal southeast Georgia, hours away from the Democratic powerhouse of Atlanta and its suburbs.
On today's episode, we look at why.
The road to the White House goes through Georgia, and the lane to that road goes through Savannah and coastal Georgia.
Plus, scrutiny of the Georgia State Election Board is growing. A trio of ethics complaints are calling on Governor Brian Kemp to remove 3 board members.
So we need the governor and Republican leadership to step up, to be the adults in the room, to call out these extremists and tell them what they are doing is wrong. And if they want their candidate to win, then he has to win fair and square.
And a lawsuit is asking the courts to weigh in on new certification rules.
Also, third-party and independent presidential candidates continue their efforts to access the ballot.
Well, I think it was a sad day for democracy.
I'm WABE Politics reporter Rahul, Bali.
I'm WABE Politics reporter Sam Gringlas, and this is Plugged In, a WABE Politics podcast. Rahul, first, can we talk about how much I love Savannah, the live oaks, the pre-Revolutionary War architecture, the ghost tours? A favorite memory of mine from the 2022 campaign was covering the Senate debate in Savannah, but I gotta say, not the haunted house that we rented on WABE's public radio budget.
You know, we were there 2 years ago for what ended up being the only debate between Senator Raphael Warnock and his Republican challenger Herschel Walker. And funny story, you know, Rose Scott told me that she actually got messages from listeners who were worried about you in our not-so-haunted house. But alas, we are taping in Atlanta as those campaign stops were only open to traveling pool of reporters who flew with the vice president, with a few exceptions.
So let's dive into this trip, a bus tour of sorts that stretched over 2 days, the first joint interview with Harris and Walz, which was conducted in Savannah and aired on CNN, and a rally at End Market Arena in Savannah to cap off the trip Thursday evening. Rahul, you monitored that rally. What stood out to you?
So, Sam, I think it's important to remind people that this was her first speech at a campaign rally after the Democratic National Convention. So let's talk about some of the issues and something very Georgia-specific she talked about.
We fight for a future with affordable child care, paid leave, and affordable health care. And on that last subject, let's finally expand Medicaid in Georgia.
She did have a few more specifics on lowering grocery prices and housing prices, along with cutting taxes. And near the end of her speech was an important reminder of Georgia's role in recent elections.
You sent 2 extraordinary senators to Washington, D.C. You sent President Biden and me to the White House. You showed up, you knocked on doors, you registered folks to vote, and you made it happen. You did that. You did that. And so now we are asking you to do it again.
Finally, it was a very tight speech coming in at 22 minutes. Why do I mention that? I remember during the 2022 elections in Georgia that Republican Governor Brian Kemp and Democratic U.S. Senator Raphael Warnock were both very tight with their speeches versus what their opponents were doing. So, Sam, before the rally, Harris made some local stops. Tell us what she did.
Air Force Two was greeted by students from Savannah State University. Harris and Walz then boarded a red, white, and blue campaign bus and headed for Liberty County High School near Fort Stewart. The students, all band kids, football players, cheerleaders, seemed like genuinely shocked when the vice president and her running mate walked in. The Panthers marching band played the school fight song. And Harris and Walz each gave kind of a pep talk. Remember, Walz taught high school and coached football, and Harris revealed that I guess she had played the French horn as a kid.
Sometimes you hit the note, sometimes you don't, right? But all that practice makes for beautiful music.
Harris and Walz then popped into Sandfly Barbecue, known for its Brunswick stew. Our politics can be hopeful, Walz told diners somewhat off mic. It can be nice. Then on Thursday, Harris stopped at 2 more small businesses and thanked Chatham County volunteers for her campaign.
So real quick, Sam, I introduced you 2 years ago to grits. Have we introduced you yet to Brunswick stew?
Not yet, but I don't think my stomach is up for that today. Maybe in the future.
So let's back up a little more than food and talk about why this trip is so significant. Many of former President Donald Trump's campaign stops are held outside of Metro Atlanta, places like Rome, Perry, Commerce, Valdosta. But I wonder if you're going to see more stops in these regions by Harris and even future Democratic presidential candidates. I mean, in 2020, Biden did do a rally in Warm Springs, but more symbolic of a nod to FDR than to play for voters who lived in that part of the state.
So, Rahul, according to the Russell Library at the University of Georgia, the last time a Democratic presidential candidate did a Georgia bus stop tour outside of Metro Atlanta was Bill Clinton in 1992. That tour had something like 24 stops, including Albany, Columbus, Tifton, and of course, the 90s was the last time before Biden in 2020 that a Democrat had won Georgia's electoral votes. Rahul, this is about trying to chip away at Republican margins in a state where every vote counts given how narrow the margins have been. Metro Atlanta is, of course, the Democratic stronghold in the state, but its votes alone are likely not enough. And Rahul, this week I caught up with Savannah Mayor Van Johnson, who noted that Harris had just been in Savannah in February.
I don't think ever in our history, and we're 291 years old, have we ever had a president or vice president twice in the same year, much less 6 months.
And last week, I talked to Quentin Folks, deputy campaign manager for the Harris campaign, who ran Senator Raphael Warnock's reelection bid in 2022. And Folks says that is the top lesson he is applying from Warnock to Harris, the need to reach voters in every pocket of the state.
And look, Sam, Democratic candidates for governor like Roy Barnes in 2010 and Jason Carter in 2014 did plenty of campaigning in rural Georgia. But what we're seeing is even more of a focus by those statewide candidates. You saw it in 2018 and 2020 and 2022. And Sam, you've been doing some deeper reporting on this strategy going back to that 2022 Warnock campaign.
Yeah, I followed Warnock on a bus tour swing of his own through Southwest Georgia in 2022. And one of the people I met, Maggie Bell, who was then a recent grad from Albany State University.
I think when people think of rural voters, they think of farmers, white people. But really, there are Black people down here. There are Black people who want to be a part of the election process, but they don't get a knock at their door. Pay attention to these counties.
According to Brookings, 20% of rural Americans are people of color, and while rural populations are shrinking, they actually are getting more diverse. Demetrius Young is an Albany commissioner who I talked to at a Warnock rally in 2022 by the Ray Charles statue on the Flint River.
I know everybody kind of looks at Atlanta as an African-American mecca, but if you followed this blue wave, it came right through Albany, down into Southwest Georgia.
And Rahul, I called up Young this week to catch up, and he says he was really heartened to hear Harris was campaigning outside of Metro Atlanta. Even though she's not making it to Albany this trip, he says if she ever does, her first stop should be his Aunt Helen's barbershop, which is a focal point for Democratic organizing in Southwest Georgia.
So, Sam, I want to ask you more about this specific tour. The stops have focused on southeast coastal Georgia, and I have to note that some of the stops were in heavily Democratic areas like Chatham County, where Savannah is, and Liberty County, where Fort Stewart is. This doesn't seem like the red rural counties that Democrats are talking about chipping away at Republican margins. So I think my question is, what is the strategy, at least with this tour?
These cheery stops are designed to showcase the campaign's appeal outside the big metros and provide a contrast to the Trump campaign's often darker tone on the trail. These stops also seem to go a lot more smoothly than Ohio Senator J.D. Vance's awkward donut shop trip in Valdosta last week. But I think you're right, Rahul. As far as genuine engagement, this might be more about sending a message than flipping voters one-on-one. And in Liberty County, while maybe neglected by statewide Democratic candidates, it did go for Biden with 61% of the vote in 2020. The county is something like 46% Black and home to many military personnel based at Fort Stewart. These stops were quick, not super substantive, and this was not some kind of barnstorming tour with rallies in Macon, Columbus, and Albany that maybe some were expecting at the onset. And we also heard from Trump's Georgia communications director, Morgan Ackley, who said the Trump campaign is, quote, focused on turning out votes across the entire state. Democrats in Georgia are finally learning an important lesson. There is more to Georgia than just Atlanta. But Rahul, I wonder on the flip side, we saw the Trump campaign in Atlanta earlier this month, a center of Democratic support. But that may have been more to troll Harris, who spoke at the same venue a few days earlier. I wonder, though, can we expect to see Republicans, in the same way trying to encroach on Democratic ground, like in the suburbs?
Sam, we've been talking about this on the podcast. For example, Republican efforts to attract Black male voters. But as you heard on last week's episode, Democrats are pushing back on the idea that a large number are in play. Back to those suburban voters. Republicans believe there are issues like the economy, inflation, and crime that will get traction with those voters. Many of them swing voters. One key person in all of this is Governor Brian Kemp. And look, I'm not big on polls, but I wanted to share one from Fox News that was taken last weekend of 1,014 registered Georgia voters. And this was one of the questions. Do you approve or disapprove of the job Brian Kemp is doing as governor? Overall, he had a 64% approval rating. With independents, that was 50%. With Democrats, it was 51%. And look, while there's a 3% margin of error, that's really notable. And one other thing to mention, the public pause in the feud between Trump and Kemp. On Thursday morning, in a call with reporters, senior Trump advisor Corey Lewandowski was asked about the patching up between the two men.
We're a Big Tent party, right? We have people on all sides that are now unified for supporting Donald Trump's campaign against Kamala Harris because the alternative is just unacceptable to the American people.
And we saw them take another step with Kemp hosting a Trump fundraiser on Thursday. Look, the reality is Trump and Kemp, for now, have put their ugly feud to the side for the 2024 election.
Time for a break. You're listening to Plugged In, a WABE Politics Podcast.
Welcome back to Plugged In. Sam, let's leave the campaign trail for a minute. You've been tracking the ongoing drama over moves by the Georgia State Election Board. So what's the latest now?
Well, as expected, there is now a lawsuit, and it has the support of the Harris campaign. It was filed by the Democratic Party of Georgia, the Democratic National Committee, and others. The petitioners are challenging these new rules approved by Republicans on the state election board that could result in local election board members refusing to certify election results. Most legal experts agree that these local board members do not have this discretion under Georgia law, and that that refusing to certify could cause delays, disruptions, or at the very least confusion during a really sensitive time. So the petitioners are calling on the court to declare that certifying elections is a mandatory duty that must be done by the state deadline on November 12th at 5 p.m.
Now, Sam, this lawsuit is not the only possible repercussion we're talking about. Governor Brian Kemp has received 3 ethics complaints seeking to remove the 3 Republicans from the board. Explain how that would work and what happens next.
Democratic lawmakers this week have been turning up the pressure on Kemp to take action here. The complaints allege that the Republican members ran afoul of Georgia law and eroded public trust when they approved those rules on election certification amid praise from former President Trump. Democrats like State Representative Syra Draper, who we heard from at the very beginning of this episode, are calling on Kemp to refer the complaints to a state administrative court for review before the election. Kemp's office says that they are awaiting advice from the Attorney General on what to do next. Meanwhile, Republican member Janelle King told WABE this week that she has confidence her actions have been above board, both legally and ethically.
So, Sam, you mentioned the state administrative court, a court that I've gotten to know well over the last couple of weeks, covering challenges to independent and third-party presidential candidates who want to appear on Georgia's ballot.
Yeah, Rahul, what's the latest there?
So, Sam, let me walk you through what's happened since last week's hearings in a courtroom of the Georgia Office of State Administrative Hearings, where Democrat-backed challenges to ballot access were heard for Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Cornel West, the Party for Socialism and Liberation's Claudia de la Cruz, and the Georgia Green Party, which nominated Jill Stein. This past Monday, the office's chief judge recommended that all 4 were not qualified to appear on Georgia's November ballot. Then on Thursday, Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger overruled the judge's recommendation on Cornel West and Claudia de la Cruz after questioning the interpretation of the law and the 7,500 petition signature threshold. Separately, Raffensperger ruled that the Green Party nominee Jill Stein was eligible under a new Georgia state law that allows ballot access if you're on 20 other state or territory ballots.
But Rahul, Robert F. Kennedy has dropped out of the race anyway, right? So how does this affect the whole ballot access thing?
So Raffensperger didn't rule on challenges to Kennedy because he had dropped out since those hearings. On top of that, Kennedy also said that he was going to get his name off the ballot in battleground states. So, both a lawyer for him and Kennedy himself filed paperwork to withdraw his nomination petition, effectively taking his name off the ballot anyway. So, Sam, I want to reintroduce you and our audience to one of Kennedy's most passionate supporters in Georgia. I first met Melinda Hicks while she and other RFK supporters were in the Secretary of State's office last month to turn in more than 21,000 petition signatures to get him on the ballot. She collected 600 of those. She was really, really excited. Well, I caught up with her after RFK's announcement, and you heard her in the beginning of the show where she called it a sad day for democracy.
So I still consider myself a Kennedy volunteer, and I will help the campaign in other states as much as I possibly can. And in terms of my voting, that's hard. You know, I'm a ex-Democrat, so it would be difficult for me to vote for Trump. Not impossible. That's still out there for me. The one thing that is no longer possible for me is to vote for Democrats. I'm done.
So Georgia is set to have 6 presidential candidates on the ballot, something that is not normal. Since 2004, there have only been 3 presidential candidates on Georgia's ballot every year: a Republican, a Democrat, and a Libertarian. The addition of 3 candidates, generally considered to the left of Vice President Harris, means her campaign has to deal with another challenge now. And my final takeaway from this segment is that so much of voting and the execution of Georgia's elections now is in the hands of the courts and appointed officials, something I expect to continue to see through and after Election Day.
That's all the time we've got for this edition of Plugged In, a WABE Politics podcast.
Plugged In is a production of the WABE Politics Desk. Our producer is Brendan Rivers. Our managing editor is Alex Helmick.
If you appreciate this podcast, subscribe and leave us a rating. Thanks for listening.